Chapter 13. Force be with you. Outside, the world was awash in a purple-pink haze. A cool breeze ran through the streets of Mos Shuta, tossing up bits of still sizzling sand to nip at the heels of Gardula's fleeing guests. Beyond the city, their path across the dune fields fell in dramatic double shadows, lit by two massive stars setting in harmonic time. Tatooine's landscape looked entirely different than when they had left the Yuklima, and so, Ben thought, did the landscape of the future spread before him. He did not know what all he had altered with that horrible gambit, and he was unsure if all of it was good. But the galaxy would be entirely different for it. It was the will of the Force, he was certain. Yet, for all the wisdom he'd found on Tatooine in another life, here again with a second chance, peace was elusive. They walked towards the Yuklima in a daze, Ben and Terran each hauling a small anti-grav pallet of ship parts, Shmi carrying Anakin against her chest in a sling. Out of the stale air of Gardula's hall, out of binders, out of slavery all at once, and, for Ben, out of the yawning maw of what would have surely been his biggest mistake yet. He was still in a cold sweat when Terran attempted to strike up a conversation with her new companion. "What's your name?" "Shmi." "And your child there?" Shmi hoisted the babe closer to her, eyeing Terran warily. "He's called Anakin." On Terran's other side, Ben's heart clenched at finally hearing the name. Sensing her unease, Terran smiled at her. "I've a young daughter at home, just a bit older than him," he told her encouragingly. "He looks healthy. You've done well by him." Still unsure if there was an ulterior motive behind the kindness, Shmi didn't look at him when she muttered a quiet, "Thank you." Ben watched her quietly while they spoke. He could not see her infant son bundled against her breast in a makeshift sling, but he could see Shmi. Ben had never met Shmi. He'd seen hollows of her once or twice when a very young Anakin was still allowed communications with her, but of course he had never seen her in her youth. Seeing her now in the flesh, it surprised Ben just how young she was. He'd always assumed Shmi had been well into adulthood when she'd borne Anakin, but seeing her now, he hardly recognized her. He supposed that, as had been his own experience, the sands hadn't been kind to Shmi as she'd aged. But it was hardly a problem for her now. The heat and grit hadn't worn down this young mother. Her face was still smooth, drawn in a frown, but unwrinkled and taut. Her stance bespoke a bone-deep strength, her frame slight and recovering from a not far gone pregnancy. Despite all of this, she was still hardly more than a girl. She could not have been more than a year or two older than Obi-Wan. It was such a weighty burden for one so young, Ben thought. Weighty and familiar to his old, tired heart. "We weren't prepared, you and I," Ben said to Shmi silently, knowing she wouldn't hear. "But by the will of the Force, I will be this time." "Is there Terran was attempting to speak kindly, but Shmi still glared at him with a fierce protectiveness. "Is Anakin's father a slave as well? Should we go back for him?" "There is no father," Shmi spat back. She turned her face away, glaring and blushing. Terran looked away in mortified silence, his mouth iterating a short O shape. He let the conversation fall silent, but Ben could sense the private's intense pity for the slave girl and all the abuse she must have gone through. It was a reasonable assumption to make. Ben had always wondered about Shmi's claim that Anakin had no father. Had she been genuine in her claims? Had the Force truly brought Anakin to bear out of pure energy? Or had Shmi lied to Anakin and later to Qui-Gon in order to avoid the harsher truth of her enslavement? He took one glance at her and found he was fine not knowing either way. It would only heap hurt upon her to ask again. When Anakin began to cry and pull at the clothes covering Shmi's chest, Ben pointed encouragingly up ahead. "Not too much further now," he pointed, where the shadow of the giant Rylothian ship was hovering into view. "Come on." They completed their journey in tired silence. After they reboarded the Yuklima and transferred the ship parts to the electricians, the crew directed the return party to a spare residential room where they could rest. Terran lounged against the bulkhead, scrolling through a datapad of reports that had arrived in his absence, while Ben removed his cloak and hung it by the door. As he relayed to Ben, they had arrived not a moment too soon. 2 of the 4 generators had suffered a massive power leak in their absence, and without new parts the remaining 2 would have shorted out as well. Ben nodded, grateful that his bet had been worth something. Then again, he already knew that. He looked over to where Shmi Skywalker sat with her son. She had been watching the Twi'lek rush to and fro outside the room while Anakin suckled. She tore her eyes away from them and looked to Ben. "You would have given up their lives?" she asked quietly, sharp eyes watching his every move. "For a slave?" Terran looked up at Ben as well, waiting to hear the answer. Ben's training allowed him to save face. "I would have never gone through with it," he assured himself. "I only made the bluff because she would not part with you for less." Shmi remained unconvinced. She squinted at him. "You are a Jedi. I've heard stories about your kind." She looked him up and down. "Of men who keep their word. Stories which are entirely accurate, I assure you. However, when dealing with Hutts, one must speak a language they understand." Terran nodded slowly, readily accepting this. Shmi nodded, but remained sullen. She adjusted her baby to a better spot, and Ben couldn't keep from smiling when mother and son's eyes met. Shmi's love for her son was a bright beacon in the Force, as pure as Anakin's infantile devotion to this one soul in the galaxy. It made Ben's heart ache in ways he couldn't fully understand. He'd never had the luxury to imagine himself as a father. "Where will you take us, then?" Shmi asked after Anakin was settled, bringing Ben's mind back to the present. "Do you Jedi use slaves in your temples?" Ben sat up straight, affronted at the idea. His surprise made him pause before saying, "No, of course not. We abhor the slave trade, actively fight against it, in fact." He smiled at her. "Once we get the ship off this planet, you're free to go wherever you wish." "What?" Her eyes grew steadily wider until Ben could all but see the tears welling up. "But—" The girl's thoughts grasped at concepts of which she'd never conceived. "But where?" "Well, the ship is full of refugees bound for immigration into the Republic," Ben offered. "Although you are not officially one of their number, I know a man who I'm sure would be more than happy to assist you. He'll find you a place to live far away from here." Shmi took one look at her son and began to cry. Something stopped Ben from going to comfort her, but he smiled in intense sympathy as she cleaned herself, sniffling and wiping her eyes. She hoisted her baby up to her shoulder and pulled up the collar of her tunic. "Thank you, Sir Jedi." He smiled, acutely aware of the wrinkles in his face and the youth of the mother before him. "Call me Ben," he told her. She nodded. "Thank you, Ben." "Sir," Terran took the pause to rise, "the men have asked from me in electrics. Do you need anything else?" "No, thank you, Private. You did admirably today. Thank you for your assistance." "Of course, sir. Ma'am?" He nodded to Shmi and left. The Jedi and the slave girl sat in silence while Shmi cleaned Anakin's face and burped him and wrapped him back up to his thin swaddles. Unfortunately, the child was having none of it and worked a meaty fist out of his confines in short order. Shmi only tutted at him and began playing with his small hand, letting him chase her fingertips in meaningless patterns in the air. Ben was completely unsurprised when the babe reached out and summoned his mother's necklace to his hand with an instinctive use of the Force. Shmi batted it down and put it under her shirt, but Anakin stretched out his hand, and there again the pendant arrived. "Does he do that often?" Ben asked, voice amused. Shmi looked up. Yes." It was obvious she did not fully understand the meaning behind his abilities. I don't know why or how. Your son is very strong in the Force. He doesn't know what he's doing as of yet." Shmi seemed puzzled. She plucked her pendant from Anakin's hands once more, only to have him take it again when she looked back up at Ben. "The Force?" "The Force. The energy of all life that upholds the galaxy. It is what gives us Jedi our power. And, as it would seem," he smiled at Anakin, who was pulling quite adamantly at his mother's necklace, "what allows young Anakin to indulge his penchant for jewelry." Shmi looked down at Anakin and studied him with a worried frown, as if she could see the power in him. But to her, he was only a baby. Her baby, the only thing that mattered in her world. She looked up at Ben and made the Jedi lean back from the force of her fear. "Will you take him?" "No," Ben assured her and glanced down at Anakin. Would he? He had to, didn't he? And yet, that deep welling feeling in his gut, the one that had blurted out his gamble, the one that kept him functioning day in and out, now compelled him to say, "No, of course not. As I've said, the Jedi do not deal in sentient cargo." He came over to sit by Shmi now and exuded a sense of calm. He glanced down at her son. "Anakin does have the potential to become a Jedi. A very great Jedi, in fact. I've never seen such ability in an infant before. But even so, you are his mother. He made eyes with Shmi to make sure his sincerity was not lost. And unless you explicitly consent, the Jedi Order will not lay a hand on him. You have nothing to fear. They both looked down when Shmi's necklace jumped to Anakin's tiny palm once more. Ben chuckled. Though you may perhaps want to hide that from him in the future. Shmi nodded and took the wooden pendant away from him, tucking it into her shirt. Moments later, she yawned widely and sighed as Anakin began fussing. Ben cast her a compassionate look. You need rest, Shmi. There's a bed just over there. I can look after young Anakin for now. The way her neck whipped around to look at him was maternal instinct personified. He gave her a soft smile. I'm no stranger to children. I'll stay put right here, I promise. Let him antagonize someone else's accessories for a while. With painful hesitation, Shmi nodded and transferred Anakin to Ben's waiting arms. She went to the bed and lay down, watching her son through a cracked eye. It was mere moments before she fell into an exhausted sleep. Across the room, Ben looked down at his new companion. Sweet Force, he was so small. Anakin wobbled his head in protest to Ben's stiff posture, and the Jedi fumbled to gently rearrange him in his two big arms. Ben had held infants before, plenty of times. But now he was carrying the fate of the galaxy in the crook of his elbow, and he felt as though he'd break him. He had once before. Shmi breathed calmly and evenly from the other end of the room, leaving Ben and Anakin to make acquaintance in solitude. Alone with his very, very young brother of yesteryear, Ben couldn't dam the tears that stirred at his eyes. There now, he smiled shakily down at the infant. That was very rude of you, Anakin. What have I told you about frivolous uses of the Force? Anakin, compelled by the space-time continuum and the law of conservation of matter, could not recall any of Obi-Wan's lectures. In place of articulating this excuse, he pulled at the edge of Ben's tabards and spat bubbles. Ben burst into either laughter or tears. The two phenomena felt so astonishingly similar sometimes. His cheeks were wet, at any rate. Yes, that's right, the master said, laughing. But the laughing became silent sobs. Anakin remained unaffected, staring up at the weeping man in non-recognition. This made Ben cry harder. Anakin, he choked and covered his mouth with a sleeve to stifle his emotion. Tenderly, he clutched Anakin upright to his chest and leaned a cheek against the infant's crown. Tears unchecked, Ben began rocking back and forth through the waves of grief he thought he'd conquered years ago. I'm sorry, he crooned to the small chosen one and the world he had left too broken to continue on. I'm so sorry. They awoke the next morning to the sound of klaxons. Ben stiffened and shut an arm over his chest where he somehow knew Anakin would be. Miraculously, the boy was still asleep, though frowning expressively and at the cusp of a rude awakening. Ben looked around and winced at the crick that had formed in his neck. He'd fallen asleep on the floor, leaned up against the bulkhead. He grunted to stand, cradling Anakin carefully against him. What's happening? Shmi asked, rising from her bed lethargically. Ben carefully returned Anakin to her arms, and she began preemptively shushing him, bouncing him up and down to keep him at least somewhat content. I'm not sure. It sounds as if... Master Kenobi, come in. Commander, Ben answered in some confusion. What's happened? It's the hut you got those spots from, sir. Ben looked up wide-eyed at Shmi, whose face was draining of color. It's followed us. Got a small army with it too, sir. He really should have seen it coming. Ben swallowed, ears gone deaf to Anakin's cries. I will go and speak with her. No one else leaves the ship, you understand? Sir, I'll send reinforcements. No, Commander, I will go alone. If she has a quarrel, it is with me, and me alone. I will not endanger anyone else today. He'd already done enough. But, sir, surely that's an order, Commander. Of course, Master Jedi. Good luck, sir. Ben paused, and then brought up his calm again. Be that as it may, inform the bridge to raise whatever shields they've got left and prime any operational guns. Yes, sir, but this is a freighter. Ah, he was too used to working aboard Star Destroyers. Still, whatever they've got, Commander. I understand. He let the connection drop and escorted Shmi and Anakin to a room full of mothers and children who had been giving priority in the safer parts of the ship. Luckily, Shmi spoke Ryle, albeit patchily, and was able to put on a strong face when Ben left her. "You'll not go back to Gardula, that I swear on my life," Ben told her. He eyed the Twi'lek around her guiltily, even though they could not understand. "None of you." As he marched towards the landing ramp, Ben adjusted his comlink to a farther frequency as far as he could reach. "This is Jedi Master Ben Kenobi," he broadcasted on the Republic emergency line, so close but so very far away. "Requesting immediate emergency evacuation of Relothian ship Euclima, Arcana Sector, Tattoo System. Coordinates 5902/66815. We are under an active threat level 2. Ship non-navigable. Please hurry." The Twi'lek crew were now guardsmen, hastily outfitted with freighter tools for weapons and safety gear as armor. They stood at sloppy attention to see their Jedi ally off the ship. Ben lifted the hood of his cloak and stepped off board. Gardula's anti-grav float tossed clouds of sand into the air as she sailed into view, flanked by 4 dozen massive Gamorrean guards and a sprinkling of heavy artillery. Ben pursed his lips and stepped forward, resisting the urge to draw his saber. "Gardula," he said, a warning in his voice. "I thought Hutts of all people knew how to honor a bet."
"Your bet has turned sour, Jedi."
"I'm sure your friends on Nal Hutta will be interested to hear tell of your unwillingness to stand by a fair loss," the negotiator threatened. Gardula roared.
"Fair? Your stakes were a lie. You swindled me. I'm here to take back what is rightfully mine."
She waved a signal, and 3 ion cannons honed in on him in an instant.
"And to take that which you owe me, Jedi slime."
Ben let out a breath, heartbeat counting seconds. As one, the cannons fired, converging in an explosion of incendiary and sand. Half a second later, a Jedi fell from the sky with a whirling blue saber in hand. The Hutt cursed, and her guards fell into line to siege their opponent in force. But Ben Kenobi had conquered these dunes long ago. He'd always wondered if he could use these karas on a receptive audience. Light years away, Alara Dan stiffened in her seat. "Level 1, she said. The Herdessan pilot turned to look at her. "Master Dan?" "Their active threat has just escalated to a level 1. I'm sure of it." The captain blinked away his skepticism and nodded. He flicked on the comm. "Red Fleet, be advised that we are now at AT-1. Repeat, AT-1. He turned to his crew. "Shields up, guns hot. I want an escort on every evac shuttle. Has anyone made contact with Master Kenobi?" "No, sir." "Course not. What's he up to?" The captain grumbled over his controls. "As I said, sir, AT level 1. Alara leaned forward, hand going subconsciously to her saber. "I have a feeling that Master Kenobi is rather busy at the moment." Once this was all over, he really needed to reconsider how much he actually valued having a fringe. Ben blew hair up out of his eyes and swung his saber in a mad 1, 2, 3, turn, 4, 5 flip, slash, elbow, 6 step sequence to deflect blaster fire. Gamorreans were incredibly dim-witted creatures, but they made up for their challenged mental faculties with sheer persistency. Point in fact, he'd already lopped this one's arm off, but here he was again, and wielding a blaster, no less. Ben cut the gun in half and knocked the squealing warrior to the ground. His comm chirped at him for the 7th time in as many minutes. Master Kenobi, come in." "Oh, for stars' sake," he whirled, ignoring the voice. What was it about fighting in an active war zone that invited people to call him every 3 seconds? "Master Kenobi, this is Herdessan Admiral Tyvak Shan. We are on our way. What is your status?" Oh, well, about time then. After completing a textbook-quality Young Ma, Ben slapped his hand down on a comlink to clumsily open the frequency. He really must invest in a proper comm gauntlet again. He'd forgotten how handy it had been. "I don't have time to talk," he huffed, skewering another assailant before he himself could suffer the same fate. "Just follow the coordinates of this call." "Master Kenobi, what is your status? I hear saber play." "Ahsoka, he shook his head to clear dusty memories. "Alara, sorry. Is that you?" "What, didn't think I'd track you down? Yes, it's me. What is your current status? Do you require assistance? 8? No, that won't be necessary." He managed to lob off 2 arms at once and felt bad about it. "I'm very nearly done here." "I see. And what are you doing, Master?" Ben shrugged. He couldn't explain over a comm, let alone while taking on an angry Hutt squadron by himself. It had been a long day. Negotiating, he sufficed, a declaration punctuated by a well-meant pommeling. Elara paused on the other end. Duly noted, Master Kenobi. We're coming in now. May the Force be with you. When Ben had dispatched the last of Gardula's warriors, the Herdessan fleet was just coming into view in the atmosphere. You must concede your defeat, Gardula, whether on the sabak table or on the battlefield. Both have been fair, on my honor.
Now you are going to kill me?
Gardula guessed, poised to defend herself, though Ben could not tell how. No, he huffed, tired in body and spirit. He replaced his saber at his belt. It is not my place as a Jedi, nor as a victor. You've paid your debt to me. Now concede defeat, and you will never see me again. Gardula drew up her massive head and looked down at him. After a long while, she waved a huge dismissive arm.
You are not worth it, Jedi. Go die in some other corner of the galaxy.
Which was about as warm a goodbye as he'd ever get from a Hutt. By the time Admiral Sean and his fleet had landed on the surface, Gardula and her float were long gone. This left Ben Kenobi standing alone amidst the Gamorrean slaughter, sandy, sweaty, ropes charred, and pockmarked with holes left by blaster fire. While the majority of the Herdessian shuttles diverted to the ship itself, a small fighter landed nearby Ben. The ramp lowered, and half a dozen armed Herdessans spurred out, followed by Elara Dawn. Master Kenobi, she greeted, looking genuinely relieved to see him again. She came closer, looking around at the carnage with a carefully tamed expression. Can we assist you with anything here? Ben turned to look back at the battleground for himself. He must look aside, alone amongst this mess. But it couldn't be helped. After a moment of thought, he turned back to the newcomers and said, I've lost my cloak. If you spot it, I'd be grateful to have it back. In the meantime, even he would admit that he was wavering on his feet a bit, I must go sit down for a bit. He fell asleep in the back of the shuttle. They woke him on board another, much larger ship for a debriefing with Admiral Sean, to whom he gave only the barest of details. Ben was sure news of his bluff would make its rounds to the higher-ups in the Herdessan government sooner or later, but he'd prefer not to present ammunition for his own admonishment. He'd get enough of that from the Jedi Council. Thinking about the Council made his head ache, so he diverted efforts to other problems. He retrieved his cloak from the evac team, despite the fact that it was shredded to pieces and entirely useless. He calmed Senator Bail Organa, who was ecstatic to hear the news that no one had been harmed in the Euclimus debacle, and pleasantly open to Ben's last-minute ideas. Finally, he set out to locate Shmi and Anakin. They'd been swept up in the excitement of the evacuation, but would need assistance passing through customs. It took Ben nearly 2 hours of asking up and down the flagship for the proper boarding records, but eventually he found the Skywalkers' names jotted in on the roster of a small shuttle elsewhere in the fleet. He would have to wait to meet them on the landing dock. In the meantime, he had the treat to hear the Herdessan's accolades of Elara, who'd taken control beautifully in Ben's absence. According to multiple accounts, it had been pure bedlam on Herdessa following the Euclimus' unplanned departure, but Elara had rallied the troops and pulled together a plan with a rare grace befitting her station. She held her own, organizing the ongoing evacuations while forming a rescue team simultaneously. A diplomat she may have not been, but Elara was a natural-born leader. It was remarkable to see the trust she'd fostered among the crew in the short 2 days that Ben had been away. He couldn't help it when his heart swelled with pride. He'd called her Ahsoka by mistake earlier. Perhaps that was why she'd felt so similar to him all this time, he thought. She was the wishful manifestation of something he'd never gotten to see. He shook away these cogitations when the automated overhead voice announced that they were making their final descent. Ben was among the first off the ship when it landed. Quietly handing the baton of authority to Elara, whom he now knew could handle it beautifully, he jogged to meet the Skywalkers before they disembarked. Ben! Shmi smiled, the first time he'd seen her smile, Ben realized, when she saw him. Then she frowned. What happened to you? He glanced down at his ruined robes. Aggressive negotiations, I'm afraid. All is well. He glanced at Anakin, who was dead asleep, and smiled. Not just for me, I see. Shmi smiled again as she stepped down the ramp. Her face cleared, and she looked past Ben to the hectic landing yard around her, up at the gleaming space scrapers of the Herdessan capital. Her eyes stuck on the horizon, where just beyond the haze of the atmosphere, grassy mountains rose from the earth. He followed her gaze and turned his eyes to watch her expression, giving her a moment to absorb the sight of green. Then he gently put a hand to her back. "This way," he directed. He found the spot he was looking for, away from the bustling lines towards customs and off the main loading docks. "We'll wait here. He should be along shortly." "Who?" "A friend." Shmi nodded and adjusted Anakin so the sunlight wouldn't wake him. She closed her eyes and savored the breeze. She was like this when Bail Organa approached from beyond the customs barrier. "Master Kenobi," he beamed, eyeing the bedraggled Jedi with a glint in his eye. "You are a sight for sore eyes. You've had quite a few days, I'd wager." Ben laughed. "That I have. Bail Organa, meet Shmi Skywalker. Shmi, this is Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan." At the word senator, Shmi's eyes went wide. "Sir," she said, falling into a deep curtsy. Bail looked embarrassed and took her elbow to help her up. "Please, miss, Bail is my name." He gave her a disarming smile, and she nodded quietly. He looked down at Anakin's sleeping face and broke into an irrepressible grin. Behind him, Ben smiled knowingly. Bail had always had a soft spot for children. "And who is this?" "Anakin, my son." "I see. Well then, welcome to the Republic, Anakin." Bail nodded at the sleeping babe and then looked back at his mother. "Master Kenobi has briefed me on your situation. If you have no objections, I will sponsor you for immigration to Alderaan, my homeworld. You can become a Republic citizen there, move there if you like, or anywhere else once you have the citizenship." Shmi had no way to articulate the feeling in her chest. Of course I have no objections. Thank you, sir," she breathed, lost for eloquence. Thankfully, Bail seemed to understand. "Right this way, Miss Skywalker." Shmi cast a look back at Ben, who waved her on encouragingly. They escorted her safely through customs, and Shmi Skywalker made her first steps onto Republic soil as a free woman. All around, Twi'lek were excitedly dancing on their new home soil, families reuniting, pilots congratulating each other on a crisis well averted. Shmi was standing alone, beaming sweet nothings down at her son when Ben approached once more. She turned to greet him. "I cannot repay you for what you've done for me," she said. "For us." He smiled warmly at her. "Which is as it should be. You will like Alderaan. It's one of the most beautiful worlds in the core. Speaking of," Ben reached into a pocket and produced a handful of credit chips. "These are for you, to start a new life." Only after they were in her hand did Shmi realize how much each was worth. Her eyes went wide. This is too much." She tried to shove them back at Ben, but he raised his hands as if in defense. She held them out in the air between them, baffled. "I can't. You said you spent your money on ship parts." Ben shrugged. "Gadula Besedi drives a hard bargain. Talented warrior and diplomat as I am, who's to say that I wasn't coerced into bribing her into cooperation after that debacle on Tatooine?" He gave her a wink. "I'll leave it in far greater hands than that of a Hutt." Shmi's shoulders slumped. She looked fit to cry. She did not. Thank you, Ben." She felt as though she was repeating herself too much to be properly understood, so she pocketed the credits and threw her free arm around his neck. The gesture took Ben aback, but he smiled and returned the hug gently, careful of Anakin's small body between them. He heard Shmi sniffle against his hood, shaking with repressed emotion. "There now," he comforted, wrapping both arms around the girl. "You're free. That is the best reward I or anyone could ask for." She drew back and wiped at her eyes. I've never been free, you know," she laughed, nigh hysterical with delight and relief. She held Anakin to her chest. "But now my son will be free too." "Yes," Ben smiled, a bittersweet feeling. He looked down at Anakin and saw everything he'd been sent back for, but perhaps not for the reasons he wanted most. "Shmi," he said, and after a second of hesitation took up both of her hands in his own. "Shmi, your son is very special," he told her. How to communicate the weight of his words? Unprecedented. She looked down at the infant now slumbering face framed by her hands and those of a Jedi Master. She looked back up at Ben with different tears in her eyes. "You want to take him away, after all?" "No." Ben shook his head to dispel her fears. No, Anakin will stay with you. He will be a great man one day, a great son to you. But know that he could make a great Jedi. The greatest, I'm certain." At her look of hesitation, he gave her hands a squeeze and added, "I do not say this lightly, Shmi. He will grow in power every day. He will need a guide. If you find yourself in need of help or guidance, contact the Jedi Order. We love our younglings as a family. He would be welcomed with open arms." He could feel her resistance to the idea of separation, but something in her ached for Anakin's well-being above all. "When would I have to decide?" she asked, tearing up again. It had been an emotional day, after all. Ben felt horrible for having to tell her all of this in such a rush. "Not now. The Order usually accepts children from infancy up to 3 years old for humans. Don't fret, Shmi, but do keep it in mind." He gave her hand another squeeze. "He is as strong as his mother. He will live well wherever the Force leads him." At the sound of his name, Ben glanced up to where Alara was waving for his attention. He let go of Shmi's hands. "I must go. Safe travels to Alderaan. You will like it there, I think." He glanced down at Anakin and could only pray to the light that he would see the child again one day. "As will you, young Anakin." He brushed a finger over the sleeping boy's brow. "Be good to your mother." He looked back up at Shmi and brushed her elbow. "Take care of yourself." She looked fit to burst with a million emotions. She nodded at him, choking on words and tears and laughter. He turned to go, but she stopped him before he was too far off. "Ben?" He turned. "May the Force be with you." He smiled at her and bowed lowly, as if to a master. At the final debriefings with Alara and the senators, Ben hardly spoke at all. Perhaps owing to his haggard, battle-worn appearance, they did not rely on his attention very heavily, for which he was grateful. He found himself falling into a brood, even as they tied up loose ends and said their goodbyes. He only came back to the present when Bail Organa arrived to bid him farewell. "I cannot express my gratitude, Master Kenobi," the young senator said, accentuating his handshake with a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Nor I, Senator. You have great things ahead of you. I look forward to watching your career in the years to come." Bail's eyes shone with boyish elation, but he curbed it to a more businesslike, "I shall look for you along the way, Master Kenobi." Ben smiled. "In the meantime, take care of yourself, Bail, and may the Force be with you. And also with you, Master." The repetitious phrase stuck in his mind long after he'd boarded the small Republic shuttle back to Coruscant, long after Alara had begun tapping out her council report in silence, casting him looks, and waiting for him to do the same. But in his state of mind, Ben couldn't think of reports and councils and consequences. His mind was awash in the words of Alara, of Shmi, of Bail, of everyone he'd ever known. May the Force be with you. The Force was with him. His life was a testament to that. This mission was a testament to that. But when, if ever, should a Jedi ask if he was with the Force? Ben pulled up his hood and leaned back in his chair. Images of Gamorreans and Twi'lek danced before his eyes, accentuated by the image of himself as a slave trader, selling a boy who might never become a Jedi, might yet become a Sith. "Force help me," he thought. Slipping or not, he could no longer tell. "Force, catch me."